place the previous piece of legislation, it made provision for the generation of electricity. And that permeates through the entirety of the legislation. It made no provision at all for storage. It made no provision for transmission and distribution of electricity. And when you hear any of the criticisms of the normal Barbadians who would have invested in solar technology, complaining that they have invested in solar panels on their homes, and they thought that they would be able to sell electricity to Barbados Light and Power and then be making a return because they don't have to pay any electrical bills, and then there's a fuel adjustment charge, and then how is it that they're now supplying electricity to Barbados Light and Power on the grid, but they're still having a bill where they have to pay? The whole thing was sold to them as bringing certain returns. And I think all of that discussion has to go back to the framing of legislation and the frame of policy. You see, the simplistic distinction that Barbados is a society and not an economy, or that we can distinguish between the two, or we can separate them out and have an economy over here and a society over here, seems to be coming back. Because when I was in this place, like Senator Paris was, and Sir, you were in the other place, we heard a lot of that discussion. And it seemed to me that what my good friend Senator Walters was trying to frame was a discussion that asked certain pertinent questions that Barbadians are asking. But I fear that that is an oversimplification of a very important issue at stake. When this current legislative framework was put in place, the Barbados Light and Power license was extended to 2028. The government of the day chose to put a legislative framework in place that essentially did not match the economic reality, because renewable energy didn't just turn on in May 2018 when the Barbados Labour Party was voted into office. Professor, I can't remember his name, Oliver Helly, I was going to refer to him by his sweet baritone voice in the university choir. But years ago, when I was a student at university, gave the Sir Winston Scott Memorial Lecture saying when the oil runs out, the sun will still be here. So that to try to make it sound that this was a political soundbite in a campaign that Barbadians were hooked onto, and then somehow hoodwinked into going to the banks and borrowing money, and it is unfortunate. This country has had a long investment in renewable energy from the time of the 1970s and 80s for solar water heaters and down the road. And Barbadians understand that Bajans who have electric cars or hybrids understand the savings that they have made in relation to renewable energy and alternative sources from fossil fuels, fueling how they go about their daily lives. But this legislation was passed in 2013. And the reason why government has sought to bring a more comprehensive bill, and you hear criticisms elsewhere that the government is rushing this legislation. For a long time, I heard the discussion from this corner to the leader of government business. When is the government going to bring the legislation that it is working on or it had promised? And now the legislation has come, we're hearing that it's being rushed. And it is unfair to those persons who have worked assiduously on bringing a more comprehensive regime. And when I say this, the Electric Light and Power Act is a day late and $1 short when it was passed in 2013. Because the license given to the Barbados Light and Power to extend up to 2028, that was what the license was for. But it made no provision for storage of electricity. Are you building out a renewable energy sector and people investing in solar? But at the time, this technology was now setting its way in the world, And we felt that solar panels would give us access to electricity, but at the time, no one really thought about the question about storage. No one thought about the question of distribution and transmission. But by 2013, these were things. And when we look at the legislation, this bill, and it is not a knock on the last administration. By no means am I trying to do that, because this was fit for the time. But at the same time, when we look at it, the supplier of electricity was given a license to extend. So who was this legislation intended to capture? There was no other player coming into the market to provide electricity, to generate it. Yes, it was liberalized. The market was liberalized in law. But in fact, it was not, because the solar uptake that we have in the country was predicated on a different arrangement. And what you have where the grid is filled, I can't use the technical terms like the minister, you have the grid being filled up, and there's no more capacity that the grid can take. The regulatory regime now has to be set by a certain legislative framework, which this Electrical Supply Act purports to do. And I want to bring to the attention of the Chamber, Mr. President, what I consider to be the fundamental ethos which is different in the framework. When you look at the two and you put them side by side and align them, from the very beginning of the act, you see the distinctions that are being made. And I think a lot of the time we want to just speak to the bread and butter issues. Is this bill going to bring cheaper electricity to my home? But the world does not work like that. And if we try to make Barbadians feel that we can create a piece of legislation that will automatically bring you less light bills in October, then we are not really understanding the complexities of the modern world that we live in. A lot of variables have to be put in place. And I liken that discussion of the right excellent Errol Walton Barrow when he spoke about the national debt and taking advantage of ordinary people and their expectations and heightening them to certain levels. Sir, this bill that we have to consider speaks for the first time to an electricity system for the generation, storage, transmission, distribution, and dispatch of electricity. This goes beyond the concept of just generation alone. And I want to keep it simple, because when the Electric Light and Power Act was passed in 2013, they were talking about generation of electricity. But we only had one major supplier, entity generating electricity. So while you were purporting a law to liberalize the sector, in reality, what were you doing? You were not providing for the capacity of the sector to build in its natural way. Sir, I have heard some criticism about the constant references of the minister in the process. And I accept Senator Maliu's genuine point. What happens when we have a minister that's not reasonable? And that is a valid criticism. But I look at it in a different way. I know, because I take these things a little more seriously as a lawyer. The word minister in here does not mean the minister of energy, even although the bill says minister shall mean the minister of energy. No minister by themselves runs the ministry. And perhaps, and I'm sorry that Senator Reverend Dr. Rogers is not in his seat, because we sat on the Constitutional Reform Commission, and I am not going to bring tales out of school. We will lay our report on Monday before Her Excellency the President. But one of the things that we have not done well in this country is to deconstruct a lot of the systems that we have created. Now, we have adopted the English formulation or the British formulation of the minister must do this and the minister must do that. So when the leader of the government business said today that she was instructed in the Carolina Principles, what does that mean? It means that the minister acts through the agencies of his or her ministry. And it's understood that the ministers, when referred to in legislation, is not exercising a personal power, but this power can be lawfully exercised through the ministry. And it begs the question, when you evaluate the extensive amount of work that is required to manage this supply of electricity under the legislation, whether or not we ought not have been creating an authority and giving them the expertise. I'm not saying that the civil servants cannot do this work, because we received a briefing from experts within the ministry, persons that I know who I went to university with, who are well versed in these areas. But I am sure that the technical capacity for the management and administration of this, as the minister said, we're now trying to outfit other agencies of government. But the point I really want to make is, have we not come to the stage where in Barbados that we need to move beyond the British formulations of the structures of government to create autonomous departments that the government can rely on in relation to advising on policy at the national level, where the competency is there, where the minister can bring to cabinet objective, qualified, and verified information about the status of the sector, and that information is shared with the parliament so that there can be some accountability as to how government is run and functioning, so that while the criticism is that the minister shall develop and direct the planning, development, and monitoring of the electrical system, I understand the criticism that the minister now might be competent, that there may be no minister that reaches that level of competency in the future. In fact, you might find a situation where in the last two administrations of the DLP, there was not even a Ministry of Energy, but it formed part of a division within the Ministry of Finance, so that there was no day-to-day ministerial direction on energy policy, as was and that is the remit of the last government. But my real criticism is that when we look at the awesome responsibility of the minister, we should not feel that Barbadians, we need to have an energy expert as Minister of Energy. This work is being done by the expertise that exists within the government department of the Division of Energy, and we have competent people there, competent advice there. So that perhaps we need to start working to reform the public sector to ensure that we're not talking about the minister, but we're talking about autonomous departments that can fill the breach and advise government and be responsible to Parliament to give advice when we have to come to deal with these complex pieces of legislation. Sir, again, the advisory committee advises the minister. It looks innocuous, and I understand the criticism that you might want to have a committee that the minister can rely on, and is not a rubber stamp body that just does what the minister says or presumes. Well, we understand what the government's policy is. We don't want to anger the minister who appointed us. We're grateful for the little pick that we get, and therefore there is no real independent, autonomous advice from any technical expertise coming to the minister. That has not been my experience. In fact, I think the minister would tell you some of these people who serve on these committees are overwhelming you with the level of expert knowledge that they have. But I just want to indicate their advice on the question of licenses, the issuing of licenses, the renewal of licenses, and the assignment of licenses. And in Section 8 of the Act, it states that very clearly, so that when renewal is mentioned in the Act, you don't have to mention the committee. When assignment is mentioned in the Act, you don't have to mention the committee every time there is a question of the issue, renewal, or assignment of licenses. I don't mean to criticize the point made by Senator Waters, but that is just cumbersome drafting of legislation. So the bill should not be criticized because it does not refer to the committee in every other section, because the opening section of the advisory committee in clause 8 of the bill speaks to that. We have heard a lot of criticism of the bill in the short time that it was put on Parliament's website for our consideration about the whole question of the absence of interveners. Now, in clause 4, or sorry, I should say section 4 of the existing legislation, I believe is, section 5, 4B. Provision was made for an opportunity to be given to interested parties during the period in which applications for licenses are made to make representations to the minister or objections. That has been excised from the legislation. And all of a sudden, we hear the criticism that Barbadian and the public interest is now not going to be adequately represented because the government has taken this on. Now, you want to put a photovoltaic panels on your roof. What public interest element is there in giving someone the ability to go to the minister to object or make representations in relation to your license? What is the public interest there? I understand the public interest in relation if you had an electrical supplier like the public utility, which has obligations under the Fair Trading Commission Act and the Utility Regulation Act in the performance of the delivery of the service. But what public interest is there at the application for a license to supply electricity? In a fair competitive market, we're not talking monopolies now, we're talking antitrust, we're talking fair competition. When an applicant applies to supply or to provide storage at the level of ordinary household or even a business, what is the interested party? What is the interested person? Could you imagine when we talk about attracting the level of investment, and not only investment in terms of dollars, but investment in terms of technology that we don't have in this country, that we want to exploit the wind, we want to exploit the sun, we want to exploit the waves and all the technology so that we can survive in this world that we are in? Can you tell me that we can plan a future for the next 20 years to depend on fossil fuels in Barbados? We understand the price of oil has gone down. We don't control the variables for oil, Brent crude on the international market. We don't even really understand why they go up and down. Because sometimes we hear that when there's a war, the price goes up. Wars all over the place now. Israel now starting war with Lebanon, but the price going down. But can you plan the 20, 25-year, 30-year future for Barbados on the basis of fossil fuel alone? Will you tell your children that as a legislator, you've participated in a debate where you have scoffed at the idea of renewable energy being part of the paradigm for how we plan out the orderly development of the country? Do we understand the ramifications of dealing with that? These are questions that have to be asked based on the questions that were asked to the government, and to show that the policy dice that you want us to roll is not as simplistic as a question of oil going down, everything in Barbados must go down at the same time. I am not a financial expert, and I can't tell you that I can delve into the futures market and these kinds of considerations. But I would certainly want to make the point that any investor who comes into Barbados, whether it bringing technology or capacity or knowledge or even financial resources into investing in our renewable energy sector, whether it's to meet goals for 2030 or whether we have to push them back, the current needs that we have as a country. What is the public interest of an interested person saying to the minister, don't come? Now I understand if there are environmental impact considerations, because those are dealt with at the town planning stage. You still require town planning permission to erect these installations. And I will say this, we know that the Cahill project that was spoken of by the last administration, that wasn't stopped at the level of the minister issuing a license. That did not get through the environmental impact stage. So to give the impression that the removal of an intervener at the stage of the issuance of a license to operate an electrical supply system is now some great problem for the people of Barbados. This has nothing to do with rate setting or the prices determined or tariffs determined by the Fair Trading Commission. That has not been interfered with. This is a process of applying for a license to supply electricity, whether it's through generation, transmission, distribution, storage, and things of the like. Now, I am not going to say that there are no public concerns, but what is the minister required to do under the application for a license? And I can take the time to take the country through it, the chamber through it, and hopefully the country chair, because there has been some mischief out there suggesting that the government is up to sinister motives. And the first thing is transparency. The minister makes the decision. And as I said, it's not the minister, but it's the ministry's collective work that determines how this license process will go. When the interested party says, I want to make representations, do you give them the application? Do you give them the proprietary data of the applicant? Do you give them the technology that they're planning to bring in the company so that the interested person can look at it? And at this stage, who is the interested party? The previous legislation, the existing legislation that we're attempting to repeal today, does not go into all of that. And I'm informed by lawyers who advise in the sector that several opinions have gone out since this bill was passed, this was passed into law since 2013, speaking about the problems that this section has caused. Because no investor is going to want to come and give up their proprietary data and information about their business systems just because some unknown person, an interested person, under Barbados law. It doesn't happen in Jamaica and St. Lucia where this is regulated by similar pieces of legislation. But at the license application stage, we're talking about blocking or interfering millions of dollars of investment. And it's not only foreign direct investment coming in. And I want to say to my good friend, Senator Walters, I am a full convert of the economic model of how Barbados has to operate. That was explained to me by the late Right Honorable Professor Owen Arthur. Is you need to have a certain amount of foreign direct investment coming into Barbados each year, else we will not be able to balance our books or maintain the standard of quality of life. The government cannot do it by taxes or borrowing alone. And the time must come for us to stop scoffing at foreign direct investment into a small nation like Barbados. We have to accommodate it. The fulcrum of Barbados's development for 300 years has been on the basis of foreign direct investment.
Senator Walters.
Mr. President, Senator Nichols is misleading the House, suggesting that I was scoffing at foreign direct investment. The comment I made is to allow the Chamber to understand that the need and request for foreign direct investment must not take over precedence over the need of consumers in this country, and that there must be a balance when moving to renewable technologies, using foreign direct investment or local investment matched squarely against the needs and the pockets of the consumers, the person that have to pay the utility bills.
Please proceed, Senator Nichols.
I thought that the good senator rose to made the point I was making. I probably think I may have put it a little more eloquently than that. But I think he's saying the same thing that I'm saying. So I certainly don't understand why he rose to say that is a point of elucidation. I wasn't misleading. And I wasn't really speaking necessarily to the senator, a point that he made. But there is a view that foreign direct investment must be looked at with a very jaundiced eye, and that we must be very careful and very suspicious of it. And I'm saying that I'm a convert of the philosophy that if we don't have enough foreign direct investment, then the only sources of government revenue have to be taxes or borrowing. And if we want to sustain a level of quality of living in this country, given the structure of our economy and given where we have come from, we need it. So if you're going to have a busybody who, like a certain person who the court just made a person know they can't file actions in the court, but 80 actions in the court. So if you have a person who decided every time somebody applies for a license to do a renewable energy project in Barbados, and the minister has to consider, I can put in an objection. What is the public purpose of that objection? This is not an objection to how they integrate within the system and affect tariff setting, which is the domain of the FTC. This is not about the environmental impact of the development on the land in Barbados and how it affects communities. That is the domain of the town planner. This is the question. So you're going to ask the minister, or I want to see if they have the financial wherewithal to run the project. I want to see if they have the technical capacity to be able to administer this project. I want to see if their decommissioning plan 30 years from now meets the specifications 30 years from now, because I am an interested party. And if you have an interested party at the level stymieing the development, then you will frustrate the build-up of this sector. So one of the things that the government is trying to do is to play catch-up. Because when the present legislation was passed, no serious contemplation was given, as I said, to things beyond distribution. This bill that is under consideration here is so mammoth in its scope that a debate in this chamber and in the other place next week will not do justice to how it will transform. I mean, when I look at this bill, and I can go back, I had a lot more things to say, but I see the president looking at the clock. But I know I'm only 10 minutes into my presentation. System planning. That was absent from the last piece of legislation. And again, I say, I don't want my colleagues from the Democratic Party, I think I can call both of them that no, sir. They're two of them here now. There was only one before, right? But the last piece of legislation, or the current legislation, did not provide for government to operate. And I think that is a symptom of the fact that there was no coherence at the ministerial level. When you have a minister of energy now, not operating within the confines of the Ministry of Finance, you can give wider scope and reflection on government policy. And that is what is happening here, because the minister now directs the planning, development, monitoring of the electricity system for the purpose of ensuring the utility, the public utility, to develop integrated resources and resilience. The minister spoke about that today. Grid modernization. Now, which legislation before required them to deal with a system, electricity system, that deals with grid modernization before? This is comprehensive, this is far-reaching. And in a country where, and I certainly have felt the impact, my colleagues on this parliamentary team know, that flooding is now going on in places in St. Thomas that never occurred before. We have now to be more resilient. And the ministry is requiring the public utility to develop systems to ensure that Barbados can meet the challenges that we have ahead. So we can talk about reducing electricity bills. I'm not saying that that is not what the government is about, but these are bigger challenges in this bill. And to ask Barbadians to dismiss the government's efforts today on the basis of whether your light bill is going to come down in October is to do an injustice to what the regime that is being ushered in by the Electrical Supply Act. Its electrical supply bill purports to inaugurate in this country, Mr. President. Sir, I have no doubt that we have not gotten everything right in energy in Barbados in the last 20 or 30 years. No doubt. I have no doubt that the last administration, when they passed the Electric Light and Power Act, was making a start. This is an improvement, and I understand that there's no widespread opposition from the opposition centers, although my friend is yet to make his contribution to the debate. But I understand that there's no opposition, and we probably might get more heat than light in any event. But there is no widespread opposition to the wide impact of the bill. But I want Barbadians to start to address their minds to some of the work that government is doing outside of the filter, from my side and from the other side and any other sides. We can even listen to Senator Malloy and Senator Drakes on these matters. Keen to hear what she has to say if she's making a contribution to the debate. But sir, this bill is an important piece of legislation. When I saw it, I contacted the minister and told her in the way that I would tell her as an old schoolmate, this is a big deal. This is an important and revolutionary change in terms, not only in the liberalization of the sector, but trying to bring order to a sector that has galloped ahead of the existing legislative framework. It is also bringing a demand on the government to outfit the department, or I should say the ministry, to ensure that it can manage the requirements under this piece of legislation in a way that will redound to the benefit of Barbados long to the future. So, Mr. President, with those words, I am happy to support this bill, and I'm obliged to you for the time given to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Nichols. Senator Drakes.
Thank you, Mr. President. I must say that I've enjoyed this debate so far. It is an area that I'm not necessarily intimately tied to, but I do have some vested interest, particularly as it relates to how the green economy in particular in Barbados has evolved, and the activities around the targets that we have for being, and I will clarify this, carbon neutral by 2030. Not 100% renewable energy. The two are distinct and different. And I think that needs to be said. But nonetheless, Mr. President, the leader of government business did a comprehensive overview of the bill. And the Honorable Member, Senator Walters, I believe, brought some good issues to the table as it relates to bringing the bill to the reality of what a lot of Barbadians feel in relation to the cost of energy in Barbados. And Mr. President, I want to go at this bill and debate it or make my contribution from the standpoint that this is a very complex issue. It is a complex sector. And its core is wrapped up in the design of the energy or the electricity sector, I would say. And I say that because the design is primarily based on three areas, and we've talked about them today. The cost, the type of energy, whether it's renewable or fossil fuel, and the reliability as it relates to the stability of the grid and the distribution network that you have, those three things. And those three things, Mr. President, have trade-offs. You cannot get all three at optimum. You cannot get cheap energy that is renewable in nature right now, and it cannot be 100% reliable. That is the problem that we are facing. Because by its nature, renewable energy, as we've heard earlier, is intermittent. So it brings an element of instability to the grid, affecting the reliability. And then because of the cost of capitalizing the infrastructure, it is expensive. So, Mr. President, those are the trade-offs. So, how these things then are balanced is directly related to the design of the type of electrical system or electricity system that we have in Barbados. And if that is so, the question has to be first looked at from what do we have now, or what did we have in the past, a historical context. We had a public utility that generated, transmitted, distributed, sold electricity to all of the end users. You got your bill in the mail, you paid it, and that was how the design worked. You had a public utility that was a monopoly, that had a license, and they did everything in relation to generation, transmission, and the supply of electricity. And it was also based on fossil fuels, which relative to renewable energy was still relatively cheaper than renewables, and it was based on a reliable grid system because you had one actor managing that entire system of supply of energy. So that was the design. Because of the environmental concerns that we have globally, and Barbados, and rightly so, wanting to play its part and being a first mover and being at the forefront of best practice, we then said we wanted to move towards being 100% renewable energy supplied. And Mr. President, what that meant was a significant and disruptive transition from the old design of the electricity sector to a new design, which to my mind, Mr. President, I'm not even sure we truly understand what that design looks like. I could be wrong, but based on how the sector has moved ahead so quickly in relation to private sector interests, the technology, I'm not sure we understand what our electricity system looks like in 2035. I'm here we do. 2045, that may be an unknown because of the type of technology that we're dealing with and the pace that is being developed. But what we do have is an interim period that we are in, which by nature is disruptive, and it gets messy because you're dealing with a complex system. And there are various iterations that will happen along the way. That, Mr. President, in terms of design, is where you have renewable energy being onboarded. It is intermittent, so there will be some issues with, again, reliability in terms of the stability of the grid, costly upfront, as we have heard today, and we all acknowledge that this will not be a cheap transition. And, Mr. President, we will still have to rely primarily on fossil fuel, oil, by and large, for the next 5 to 7 years. So there's still that cost element or external element of cost coming in that is being imported because we still will be importing oil from outside to sustain our energy demands. So that mix of renewable energy, fossil fuels, IPPs, independent power producers coming onto the grid, it all creates a level of disruption, Mr. President. And that is what we are experiencing at the moment. Mr. President, if then you cannot have all three things at the same time. If there are trade-offs to be made in relation to cost, reliability, and the type of energy that you have, it then has to be the question of how do you rationalize the sector in the interim until you reach the point where you want to be. And I'm happy that in this legislation that there is a dedicated section, Clause 5, we heard about it by Senator Nichols and Senator Cummins, that we are establishing a systems planning unit. It is critical that that unit is established. There was mention of a grid modeler. Mr. President, I cannot stress to you that unless that is established and functioning with all of the data requirements that it needs, we are going nowhere fast. We are going nowhere fast. Because, Mr. President, at the moment we have a number of small IPPs on the grid. We have a number of applications that are approved, but not on the grid, Mr. President. And all of those persons have an expectation of a return on investment based on the feed-in tariffs. That is the reality, Mr. President. But if those smaller producers do not make up a significant amount of the energy that is produced, you still have a responsibility through the public utility to produce electricity. So there is a balancing act that needs to be had. And I think, Mr. President, Barbadians don't have a full appreciation of that balancing act. And I'm hoping that today, based on the contributions from both the government side and the opposition side, that is the message that comes out in this debate. It will not be perfect, and it will not be cheap in the short term. In the long run, that's a different story, because we all know that sometimes once investors get accustomed to a certain level of return, they find other ways to build in costs to pass on to the consumer. So instead of your usage being the bulk of your bill, it might be things like management fees, grid fees, this fees, the next thing. Mr. President, you understand where I'm going with this? So I understand the angst that a lot of Barbadians would have in relation to the cost of electricity in both the short run and the long run. Because, Mr. President, there's a saying here in Barbados that once it goes up in Barbados, it don't come back down. Once it goes up, it does not come back down. But, sir, in saying that, I want to also highlight that there's another element of the system that also is not being taken into consideration in terms of the cost to the end consumer. And that is those who would then onboard storage. That discussion in the full public domain has not been had, Mr. President. So there are a number of elements that still need to be integrated from an engineering standpoint, but from the economic standpoint, have not been fully fleshed out, discussed, and understood by the country. Mr. President, as I said, this balancing act between cost, reliability, and the type of energy is also reflected in what the Barbados Light and Power at the moment, based on at December 2023, the information coming from the Barbados Light and Power is that of every dollar of revenue, and this is where it gets very crystal clear, pun intended, yes, pun intended, every dollar of revenue that Barbados Light and Power receives in revenues, 51 cents goes to fuel costs and feed-in tariffs. 51%. So half of the revenues that the Barbados Light and Power collects goes to fuel costs and feed-in tariffs. And if, again, we're saying we want to place more producers onto the grid, that means what? Greater level of feed-in tariffs. But again, if we increase the amount of producers, but we're still being reliant to a substantive degree on fossil fuel, the fuel costs will also remain. So there is an element, Mr. President, of what the consumer will pay in the short run that I genuinely, and I asked this question, I think it was in the last bill that we spoke about. I think there was an amendment to this bill, to the previous bill, the act. And I said, there needs to be a clear, frank conversation to Barbadians about their electricity costs in the next 3 to 5 years. Because the economic argument around moving towards renewable energy was that we were going to save foreign exchange because we are no longer going to import the level of fossil fuels that we had in the past, and we were going to save that foreign exchange, and therefore there was an economic argument. But if in the interim, fuel cost still remains in the system and being produced on the grid, feeding electricity, we have the IPPs moving into the sector, and 51% of the revenues collected by the Barbados Light and Power in 2023, of every dollar, is going to fuel costs and feed-in tariffs. We are stuck somewhere at square one as it relates to cost, Mr. President. And I want to highlight here, Mr. President, based on global petrol prices data, 2023, the average global cost of residential electricity based on 150 countries was 15 cents per kilowatt hour. For commercial, 15 cents per kilowatt hour.
Sorry, Senator Drake, just to be clear, in what currency?
US.
US dollars.
US dollars,
Thank you.
Mr. President, so that there's a parity across when I speak to different countries. The global average in US dollars is 15 cents per kilowatt, or you can round that off to 16 cents for residential rates per kilowatt hour, and 15 cents for commercial. In Barbados, Mr. President, it is US 31 cents per kilowatt for residential rates, and 37 cents per kilowatt for commercial. And that is based on a number of things. The small size of the market, the tax regime, the cost of energy from Barbados from anywhere in the world in terms of shipping costs, Mr. President. Other Caribbean countries, Mr. President, Jamaica, their residential average costs, US 27 cents per kilowatt for residential rates. Trinidad, of course, oil and gas country, as we know here. Yeah. I will ignore the asides, Mr. President. 5 cents. Just next door to us. Sounds nice, it does. But again, the trade-off, it would be considered dirty fuel based on the discussion around renewable energy, but it is cheap. That's why I'm trying to get people to understand this trade-off is real, Mr. President, and it must be managed. The only other countries in the region that have a higher rate than Barbados in terms of the residential cost, Bahamas at US 42 cents per kilowatt, and Bermuda 52 cents per kilowatt. So, Mr. President, The question overall then has to be, what energy system design gives us the most affordable energy given the renewable energy targets that we have that is reliable? That is the question. That is the question. What is the energy design that allows us to at least optimize our ability to move towards renewable, get the price down, and still maintain a reliable grid that allows for the smooth day-to-day running of Barbados? Because from the time you have an unstable grid, everything goes haywire. Ask the people in places like South Africa that have to do load sharing, where you have to shut down one place so that you can bring online another place. Load shedding, sorry, right? You cannot manage an economy, you cannot manage a society, Mr. President, with that type, especially in Barbados where we're so small. We cannot manage our electricity system in that way, so there needs to be reliability. But, Mr. President, that question around cost, around reliability, and around renewable energy is impacted by some other things. We know that we have a quarterly report by the central bank governor, and the sole mission from both sides of the aisle, I think they would agree, is that Barbados must grow. But in order to grow, you need energy. In order to grow, you need energy, Mr. President. And then what type of energy mix is appropriate, given the new technologies that are coming on stream? In addition to that, I think a conversation around the number of players in the industry and the size also needs, and the technology needs to be considered. The producers, the storage providers, all of those things need to be taken into consideration as it relates to design. And then, on top of that, the geopolitical conditions. Senator Malu raised the issue this morning, earlier, about China. We have the US gun-ho ready if drill, baby drill. So if we have a situation where the price of energy or a barrel of oil, the price of a barrel of oil drops to $50 US, you know how many countries, Mr. President, can put renewable energy targets on hold? Just that one factor. So we have to decide what we are going to commit to. I believe that there have been iterations of the Barbados National Energy Policy that has charted a way forward. Clearly, there is a lot happening in this space, and we may possibly now have to reconsider timelines and targets. There's no bigger proponent for the green economy and utilizing things like wave energy than Senator Drace, Mr. President. However, there's a sobriety that needs to be had as well, and practicality. Because if we are moving in a direction where Barbadians cannot afford the transition, then we have to relook. How are we going to balance the type of energy that we're bringing on board for Barbadians to consume and the cost of that electricity? The cost of that energy, and then by and large, the cost of electricity, Mr. President. Sir, if we are saying that these things are not mutually inclusive, we cannot have it all. And we are living in a time where the cost of living across the globe not just Barbados, across the globe. You talk to anybody in the United States, United Kingdom, they will tell you, or if you just travel outside of Barbados, you will realize that this is a global problem. Granted, Barbados has the ability, through its tax regimes, to impact and affect the cost at things like pump. That is something the government can do in terms of policy and relief. But however, coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, the economic policies that were instituted then, Mr. President, we are actually now seeing the effects of it from an economic standpoint in terms of the cost of goods and services globally. And Mr. President, I will wrap up by saying that I am hoping, and based on this bill, there seems to be a lot of work that is happening in the renewable energy space and the electricity sector. One of the glaring omissions, however, and this was raised earlier, is the license to the public utility. That is a major factor in what that energy system looks like and the electrical system looks like in the future, in very near future at that, Mr. President. And I think that it is the government's responsibility to be frank and open about what are the plans as it relates to the public utility, and how that then will affect consumers at the end of the day. Because, as I've noted, if we are billing in costs that both includes fossil fuels and the feed-in tariffs, then do we have to then look at things like subsidized rates for lower income housings, for instance, households that have greater than 7 persons below a certain income bracket? Those are the types of policies that we would have to start to look at, so that the people at the bottom, the people who simply cannot afford, not the ones running ACs all day long, but the people who have a certain level of standard of living, Mr. President, that they are kept above something that is dignified in Barbados. Because, Mr. President, if that is the case, and there is a substantial increase in electricity rates without a review of the characteristics and the types of households and their usage, we're going to find ourselves in an even worse situation as it relates to poverty. Poverty, Mr. President. But I assume that the government, because it usually says it has all bases covered, they are thinking about these things. And I'm sure that the substantive minister, who is the leader of government business, has been in consultation about these forward potential scenarios as it relates to the cost and the cost of energy and the price the consumer pays if we continue to have these built-in costs that make up, as I said earlier, at the moment, 51 cents out of every dollar of revenue that the Barbados Light and Power collects. So, Mr. President, this issue of renewable energy, it is an issue of energy security, it is an issue of national security, but it is also directly and intimately related to our ability to transact and produce, supply goods and services here in Barbados. Once you increase electricity rates, everything, Mr. President, increases. Every single thing increases. Something as simple as refrigeration for cold storage goods is affected. So I, Mr. President, will continue to monitor from the outside what is happening in this space. There are a lot of things I like in the bill. I would say that. but there are also some things that concern me. But Mr. President, my aim this afternoon was to highlight that it is an issue of design. Design affects the economics, design affects the type of energy system or the types of energy systems that we have on board. And Mr. President, it affects basically our way of life and how we as a people use, produce, and interact with energy and electricity, Mr. President. And as my voice is going, Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Drake. Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I rise to make my contribution to this debate on the electric supply bill. And to me, it is, well, it can almost say a bittersweet, well, bitter moment, because I had the privilege of actually speaking on the Electric Light and Power Act 2013 when that act was, this bill was introduced. I spoke on this bill in the Senate, and the renewable energy sector is an area for which I have some interest and I've followed for a long while. And I can tell you as been said before, in terms of the intention behind this, the 2013 legislation, because at that time, renewable energy supplying to the grid was not something that was widely done. You